Hi, this is the Unit 2 Psychology of Disaster Response and Preparedness, Week 3, Immediate Response to Disasters, mini lecture for Sci 333, Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change at University of Maine at Augusta. Now in Unit 1, we looked at the structural and societal issues that go into the human dimensions of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Starting this week in Unit 2, we'll be looking at the specific psychological mechanisms involved in each stage of the disaster response cycle. Now some of these psychological mechanisms make a lot of sense, and they're pretty widely understood and expected these days. However, people are weird and illogical and irrational. We do weird things, and some of our psychological responses make no logical sense at all. And they would be unexpected to most people who don't work in disaster-related fields. But among disaster professionals, many of these illogical and unexpected psychological responses actually occur with surprising predictability, which means that not only is it expected, but we must anticipate and plan for these psychological responses because they will occur. Now our first reading is a pretty short one. It's from Bonanno, Resilience in the Face of Potential Trauma. This is a lessons learned summary of previous findings or findings from previous research regarding resilience and when trauma is occurring, and the different coping strategies that people often employ. In our society, we have a better understanding of the psychological responses to trauma these days, much more so now than, say, 70, 80 years ago. After World War II, our country was kind of flooded with soldiers coming home, many of whom were dealing with post-traumatic stress and other difficult psychological responses to having spent years in war. As a nation, we were not equipped, and in fact, the aftermath of World War II is what spurred a lot of the development of community mental health resources and counseling and research. And as a nation, we are continually getting better at understanding and responding to, discussing, and now I'd even say destigmatizing a lot of post-traumatic stress and other mental health issues associated not just with war, but with all types of traumatic experiences. As a quick side note, I do want to mention that post-traumatic stress, like most psychological experiences, occurs along a spectrum. So a clinical diagnosis of PTSD with a disorder from a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, it means that the post-traumatic stress is on the worst end of that spectrum, to the point that it is causing significant disorder or impairment within the person's regular life and functioning. More than half of people will experience a traumatic event of some type in their lifetimes, but they won't all develop PTSD. Nearly everyone will have some sort of psychological response to the event, but what Bonanno is talking about in this chapter, or in this article, is that humans will cope. They will respond with resilience to trauma. And so psychology as a field wants to look not just at the negative responses to trauma, but also to some of these more positive, strengths-based responses to trauma. Specifically, consider how we can support resilience in coping so that it's more likely to be present and less likely for people to experience these negative psychological responses to negative traumatic events. Next, we have a longer chapter. This is from Kathleen Tierney, Michael Lindell, who I've met before. He's a very nice guy. Ronald Perry, Moving into Action, Individual and Group Behavior in Disasters. So now we are getting into how the patterns of psychological response to disaster kind of directs people and their behaviors and their choices that they make within disaster scenarios, and therefore what disaster professionals need to be prepared for so that we can respond effectively and keep people safe. So for example, let's say I am an emergency broadcast system in your area. And right now, I broadcast there is a flood that is coming right to you, and you need to get out of the way. You need to get out now. So what would you do? You'd evacuate, right? Well, maybe. There's a lot of psychology going on in your brain right now in response to my message that I have just given you. So, do you find my warning to be credible? Do you contact others to verify it? Do you look for other information about this event before you respond? Do you connect with other people to verify what they're going to do in response to it? If they're also going to follow my directions to evacuate. And a lot of times, disaster managers will, if possible, plan for this sort of psychological pause between receiving the message and actually acting on it, because sometimes people, communities, individuals just need that little bit of space in order to reset themselves into the scenario that they are now in. And so if we're able to provide it, we will provide it. I learned about this psychological pause from Bruce Houghton. He's the state volcanologist in Hawaii. He was my professor in disaster management and humanitarian assistance, and was also on my dissertation committee. And he would tell us about that balance that disaster managers have to keep in sometimes very extremely uncertain situations when a community has to be evacuated. So say there's a hurricane or a volcano, he was a volcanologist, and our best information is that there really could be a lot of damage. There really could be a lot of people killed if we don't get them out of the way. We have to evacuate the community. So when do we place this evacuation order? If we send it out too early, people might be sitting around frustrated in this other location. Well, nothing's happening yet. Everybody's safe and clear, but nothing's happening and time extends on. Some people might start returning right when things are starting to go very badly. But on the other hand, if we wait too long and issue the order too late, then there's not that space for that psychological pause that people will often take, and so they may not be evacuated on time. Well, my favorite story from Bruce was when he went to Iceland, I believe, for a volcanic eruption. Lots of volcanologists were there from all over the world studying it, but then there was also the team, the disaster management team, that was in charge of issuing information notices about the volcano and safety, and eventually the evacuation the evacuation order. So Bruce receives this order to evacuate, and he goes and chats with the other scientists. Did you get the order? What are you going to do? Are you going to evacuate now? He calls his wife. We got the evacuation order. I guess we're going to have to pack up our things and go. And then it hits him. How many times had he been on the other side of that order, planning on this psychological pause that people take between receiving the message and acting? How many times had he taught his students that this happened, and now here he was doing the exact same thing? So even knowing that this exists doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to be immune from it. People just take space if and when they can. So if there is that opportunity for that psychological adjustment, that is oftentimes put within the planning order. Now, in the chapter, within the household emergency response section, there's discussion of a lot of the issues that go into crafting and disseminating information and orders so that people will notice them, will understand them, and will believe them, and will act on them appropriately in response to these orders. So this section also talks about many of the widespread myths about how people respond in disaster scenarios. If we craft our plans for complete docile obedience, like you might see in like those airplane brochures about what to do if the plane crashes. Or if we make our plan based on like complete chaos and panic, like you'll see in Hollywood, every single disaster, just rioting starts immediately. They're both wrong. That's not real psychology, and it's not real human response. And so I would suggest reading through this section carefully. And also later on in the chapter, there's a section, questions regarding panic and the disaster syndrome. These have a lot of really good information about what we can expect from communities and why, and what are some of the differences that we might see in different types of communities. This chapter also discusses issues like how to inform and protect tourist populations or travelers. Maine is a tourist state. Do you think that people coming in for the lobster festival are going to know where to get emergency information? Are they going to respond the same as they would if something had happened when they were at home versus when they're on vacation? And so these sorts of things need to go on a plan, because people who are visiting the location are part of the people in the location. Yeah. And additionally, this chapter discusses how communities often will come together and mobilize themselves and each other as part of disaster response. For example, in my own personal experience, there was an ice storm when I was a teenager. Everything got torn down. We were without power for weeks. And it was very disastrous, actually, in our community. We were quite overwhelmed, and we just started going out and checking on our neighbors, people I'd never met before, maybe not even seen outside, getting to know each other and making sure we're okay and caring for each other. Also, after Hurricane Katrina, there are reports of gangs who are already kind of a mobilized group, right? So they went out and they were helping elderly neighbors and protecting the safety of their community. And so people come out and socialize and work to care for each other in all manner of disaster scenarios. Now, this is a long chapter, but it is very fascinating and it's very informative. And it gets into the expected and the unexpected that we will see in human psychology and responses. And furthermore, it gets into how do we know that this is what people do and think about and are like. And so it kind of covers the way that research in these fields has been happening for the last many decades. This week, in terms of our activities, we are going to continue the survey revision from last week. I have the same survey file posted in week 2 and in week 3, course content folders. There are also 2 discussion boards that are up for week 2 and week 3. Use either one, it's fine. And I want you to pick 3 questions and provide some feedback on those questions that are already in the survey. You don't have to add any more questions now. We added quite a few, actually. They're really good. So with whichever questions you pick, it doesn't have to be your own. Pick something that is interesting or stands out to you. Would you keep the question as it is? Does it make sense to you? Does it read well? Do you think people will respond the way that we want them to respond? Would you revise it in some way? Thinking, oh, well, maybe people will read this, not exactly answer the way that we want them to answer. In the sense of not that we want them to give a specific answer, but will we get the type of information from them that we are trying to get from them? Or will they be answering another question that we're not trying to ask? Or do you think that this question just doesn't fit, or it should just be cut out of the survey entirely? Any of those? Let me know what you think about these things. We'll continue working on this for as long as we need to until we have a good survey to pilot. So additionally, I want you to go ahead and start thinking about your interview for this semester. Who might you interview? So you have 2 options here. You can either tell me the one person that you definitely will interview. And if you choose this option, you have to have verified with that person that you can interview them during the time period in which you must interview them for this class. Or the other option is you can list 3 people that you might interview. This can be names of people, or it can be roles. For example, a Red Cross emergency volunteer. And again, I want you to have 3 possibilities or 1 confirmed. We're starting this now because I don't want you to be in a panic later when the interview paper is due and you can't find someone to interview. So go ahead and start looking now, and we'll get this prepared ahead of time. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I will look forward to hearing from you.